But essentially what ended up happening there is we created this foreign domestic firewall. We said that we have a Department of Dirty Tricks to be able to rig elections, to be able to control media, to be able to meddle in the internal affairs of every other plot of dirt in the country. But this sort of sacred dirt on which the American homeland sits they are not allowed to operate there. The State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA are all expressly forbidden from operating on U.S. soil. Of course, this is so far from the case, it's not even funny, but that's because of a number of laundering tricks that they've developed over 70 years of doing this. But essentially, there was no moral quandary at first with respect to the creation of the censorship industry when it started out in Germany and in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and in Sweden and Finland. There began to be a more diplomatic debate about it after Brexit, and then it became full throttle when Trump was elected. And what little resistance there was washed over by the rise and saturation of Russiagate, which basically allowed them to not have to deal with the moral ambiguities of censoring your own people, because if Trump was a Russian asset, you no longer really had a traditional free speech issue. It was a national security issue.
It's being called the most astonishing and frankly shocking interview Tucker Carlson has ever done. A play-by-play breakdown of the stunning censorship complex that's arisen from within our own government. We're going to take a look at the 5 bombshells to come out of that interview and what patriots are doing to strike definitively back. Hey gang, it's me, Dr. Steve, your Patriot Professor, here because knowledge is your most powerful weapon, and that's the weapon we wield on this channel each and every day. So make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button, and let's dive right in. A few days back, Tucker Carlson spoke to former State Department officer Mike Benz. Now, since serving in the Trump administration, Benz has quickly established himself as arguably the top U.S. expert on the rise of the censorship state and what many are calling the military censorship complex. The interview, simply put, was stunning. Its shocking revelations describe the process by which our deep state has risen up to actively destroy the very foundations of our constitutional republic. Here are the 5 most shocking bombshells to come from that interview. Number 5, Brexit changed everything. According to Benz, originally the internet was perceived by the CIA as a platform to bring down authoritarian governments considered hostile to the United States. So as such, free speech was actually championed as a great weapon against America's adversaries. But then something happened that changed everything.
The sun has risen on an independent United Kingdom.
Brexit. It was a political earthquake that shocked the world as more British voters came out to vote to leave the EU than had ever voted for any party or politician in the United Kingdom's history. But according to Benz, it would serve as a fixed historical point for the rise of a deep state censorship complex throughout Europe.
After Brexit, now the entire rules-based international order would collapse unless the military took control over media, because Brexit would give rise to Frexit in France with Marine Le Pen, to Spexit in Spain with the Vox Party, to Italexit in Italy, to Grexit in Germany, to Grexit in Greece. The EU would come apart, so NATO would be killed without a single bullet being fired. And then not only that, now that NATO's gone, now there's no enforcement arm for the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank. So now the financial stakeholders who depend on the battering ram of the national security state would basically be helpless against governments around the world. So from their perspective, if the military did not begin to censor the internet, all of the democratic institutions and infrastructure that gave rise to the modern world after World War II would collapse.
Number 4, the election of Trump brought the censorship complex home. After Brexit caused the CIA's decades-long practice of thwarting elections abroad to suddenly turn in on the European continent, it was the election of Donald Trump just a few months later that shocked the deep state here at home, a shock that caused them to organize the single most extensive censorship project ever conducted inside our nation.
But essentially, there was no moral quandary at first with respect to the creation of the censorship industry when it started out in Germany and in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and in Sweden and Finland, there began to be a more diplomatic debate about it after Brexit, and then it became full throttle when Trump was elected. And what little resistance there was washed over by the rise and saturation of Russiagate, which basically allowed them to not have to deal with the moral ambiguities of censoring your own people, because if Trump was a Russian asset, you no longer really had a traditional free speech issue. It was a national security issue. It was only after Russiagate died in July 2019, when Robert Mueller basically choked on the stand for 3 hours and revealed he had absolutely nothing after 2.5 years of investigation, that the foreign to domestic switcheroo took place, where they took all of this censorship architecture spanning DHS, the FBI, the CIA, the DOD, the DOJ, and then the thousands of government-funded NGO and private sector mercenary firms, were all basically transited from a foreign predicate, a Russian disinformation predicate, to a democracy predicate, by saying that disinformation is not just a threat when it comes from the Russians, it's actually an intrinsic threat to democracy itself. And so by that, they were able to launder the entire democracy promotion regime change toolkit just in time for the 2020 election.
You know, what I love so much about Tucker and the free speech platform of X is that every single day they prove that together we are unstoppable. And I've personally seen it firsthand. You know that big tech has recently tried to do just that, stop us by demonetizing this channel. But you, literally thousands of you, stepped in and you rescued me and this channel by joining our Insiders Club. You made it loud and clear to the Silicon Valley oligarchs that we're a movement, an army of like-minded patriots who refuse to be silenced by the international woke police. And so once again, I just want to take this moment to thank each and every single one of you who have joined our Insiders Club to bypass big tech's efforts at censoring us. And for those of you who want to join in on the effort and take action, just click on that link below and join our email list. That way we will never, ever lose touch with each other, no matter what big tech does. Click on that link, join our insider list, and become a part of an army of hundreds of thousands of patriots dedicated to taking our nation back together. Number 3, the deep state is destroying democracy in order to save it.
What I'm essentially describing is military rule. What's happened with the rise of the censorship industry is a total inversion of the idea of democracy itself. You know, democracy sort of draws its legitimacy from the idea that it is ruled by consent of the people being ruled. That is, it's not really being ruled by an overlord, because the government is actually just our will expressed by our consent with who we vote for. The whole push after the 2016 election and after Brexit and after a couple of other, social media run elections that went the wrong way from what the State Department wanted, like the 2016 Philippines election, was to completely invert everything that we described as being the underpinnings of a democratic society in order to deal with the threat of free speech on the internet. And what they essentially said is, we need to redefine democracy from being about the will of the voters to being about the sanctity of democratic institutions. And who are the democratic institutions? Oh, it's us. It's the military, it's NATO, it's the IMF and the World Bank, it's the mainstream media, it is the NGOs, and of course these NGOs are largely State Department funded or IC funded. It's essentially all of the elite establishments that were under threat from the rise of domestic populism, that declared their own consensus to be the new definition of democracy. Because if you define democracy as being the strength of democratic institutions rather than a focus on the will of the voters, then what you're left with is essentially democracy is just the consensus building architecture within the democratic institutions themselves. And from their perspective, that takes a lot of work. I mean, the amount of work these people do, for example, we mentioned the Atlantic Council, which is one of these big coordinating mechanisms for the oil and gas industry in a region, for the finance and the JP Morgans and the BlackRocks in a region, for the NGOs in the region, for the media in the region. All of these need to reach a consensus, and that process takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work and a lot of negotiation. From their perspective, that's democracy. Democracy is getting the NGOs to agree with BlackRock, to agree with the Wall Street Journal, to agree with the community and activist groups who are onboarded with respect to a particular initiative. That is the difficult vote-building process from their perspective. If at the end of the day, a bunch of populist groups decide that they like a truck driver who's popular on TikTok more than the carefully constructed consensus of the NATO military brass, well, then from their perspective, that is now an attack on democracy.
Now, did you catch that key observation there? Democracy became redefined from the will of the voters to the sanctity of democratic institutions. Now, we've talked about this several times on this channel. Scholars make a distinction between what they call pragmatic democracy and redemptive democracy. Again, this is absolutely key because scholars recognize that the nature of the populist revolts that are going on all over the world, of which Trump and the MAGA movement are just, the American examples of that. These scholars recognize that far from wanting to get rid of democracy, all of these movements, of course, want to restore democracy. What's technically called redemptive democracy, which is a democratic process that honors the will of the people. What do you know, right? In other words, it's the very definition of democracy, the rule of the demos, the people. But the deep state is actively attempting to redefine democracy as involving solely what the permanent political class embedded institutions wants. And that's called pragmatic democracy. Pragmatic democracy involves the various ways in which the ruling class, the uniparties, NATO, the intelligence agencies, NGOs, all govern in accordance with their own values, interests, and concerns. They're growing increasingly alienated from the values, interests, and concerns of the people, the demos. And the irony is that this dismissive disdain of the will of the people is only fueling more and more worldwide populism. Number 2, the Red Mirage was a deep state narrative. Now, you might remember this thing called the Red Mirage. It was a narrative pushed by the legacy media in the days leading up to the 2020 election. It was everywhere because of the amount of mail-in ballots that would have to be counted because of COVID. Don't be surprised if Trump looks like he's way ahead on election day, perhaps even for days, because Biden will most certainly catch up as the mail-in ballots are counted days afterward. As it turns out, that, according to Benz, was itself a deep state concocted narrative parroted by the legacy media.
Now, they did this 7 months before the election because at the time they were worried about the perceived legitimacy of a Biden victory in the case of a so-called Red Mirage Blue Shift event. They knew the only way that Biden would be able to would win mathematically was through the disproportionate Democrat use of mail-in ballots. They knew there would be a crisis because it was going to look extremely weird if Trump looked like he won by 7 states. And then 3 days later, it comes out actually the election switched. I mean, that would put the election crisis of the Bush-Gore election on a level of steroids that the national security said, well, the public will not be prepared for. So what we need to do is we need to, in advance, we need to pre-censor the ability to even question the legitimacy. This took out.
Wait. May I ask you to pause right there?
Key influences,
so what you're saying is, what you're suggesting is, they knew the outcome of the election 7 months before it was held.
It looks very bad. Certainly, what they did.
That's it. Yes, Mike, it does look very bad.
And especially when you combine this with the fact that this is right on the heels of the impeachment, the Pentagon-led, CIA-led impeachment. It was Eric Cimarella from the CIA and it was the Vindmans from the Pentagon who led the impeachment of Trump in late 2019 over an alleged phone call around withholding Ukraine aid. This same network, which came straight out of the Pentagon hybrid warfare network, military censorship network created after the first Ukraine crisis in 2014, were the lead architects of the Ukraine impeachment in 2019, and then essentially came back on steroids as part of the 2020 election censorship operation. But, you know, from their perspective, I mean, it certainly looks like the perfect crime. These were the people, DHS at the time had actually federalized much of the National Election Administration through this January 6, 2017 executive order from outgoing Obama DHS head Jed Johnson, which essentially wrapped all 50 states up into a formal DHS partnership. So DHS was simultaneously in charge of the administration of the election in many respects and the censorship of anyone who challenged the administration of the election. This is like, you know, putting essentially the defendant of a trial as the judge and jury of the trial. It was
but you're not describing democracy. I mean, you're describing a country in which democracy is impossible.
What I'm essentially describing is military rule.
Number one, the interview itself. Make no mistake, gang. As shocking as some of these bombshells were, nothing is as shocking as the bombshell of the interview itself. Given the extraordinary efforts that the military censorship complex has inflicted on our nation, it's nothing short of miraculous that an interview like this could ever see the light of day, let alone reach tens of millions of people as it has. But Elon Musk's purchasing of Twitter back in October of 2022, as it turns out, was a real game changer. It effectively took one of the major social media platforms that this military censorship complex was using to silence Americans away from that very censorship complex. Suddenly, again to their obvious shock, the deep state and their mouthpieces in the legacy media could no longer control the single most populous instant messaging platform on the planet. Not only that, but Musk himself has been exposing the behind-the-scenes censorship that was taking place under Jack Dorsey in the so-called Twitter files expose. Again, the calculus here is clear. The more the powers that be try to censor the people, the more the people will rise up. While I have no doubt that the same military censorship complex will do its best to clamp down on this uprising in 2024, Tucker's interview and Elon Musk's platform prove that maybe, just perhaps, the people are now officially stronger than the political class.